Hi, my name is Alex and welcome back to Magic Missile Minis. Today, I'm going to be sculpting a Beholder. This is the first Beholder I ever sculpted. It's also one of the very first... This is the first Beholder I ever sculpted. It's also one of the very first videos I ever posted on this YouTube channel. So I wanted this video to be a little bit of a sculpting progression, update, check-in type video where I sculpt another Beholder of a slightly different design to keep the video interesting, but to be a little marker to see how far I've come as a miniature sculptor. But now on with the painting. First things first, we start making the armature. To give this Beholder the illusion that it's floating, I'm going to have one of his eyes be shooting flames at the base, and I'll have the wire run through that. I wanted this Beholder also to have a sideways mouth, so I bend the main wire into shape on the one side, and then I add another piece of wire for the other to create both jaws. I then surround the armature in tinfoil so that I don't have to use too much material to cover it, especially just for the bulk and the size of the Beholder. With the armature finished, we can start adding some material onto it. Rather than just using green stuff for this, I used a mixture of green stuff and milliput, as it's a lot more cost-effective to mix these materials when you're making larger miniatures. So I covered the entire armature in that. Then, to create an armature for all of the little tentacle eye things that the Beholders have, I cut out some thinner pieces of wire, and before any of our Milla stuff has set, I add the wires into it. Here you can see I tried a different camera angle. It doesn't stay like this forever. I ended up not liking this after looking at the footage. It's just a little bit weird, I don't know. But camera angles aside, I start posing all of the wires, thinking about what direction I want the eyes to be looking, and then cover those in some green stuff. I specifically cover these in straight green stuff and not the combination of milliput and green stuff, so that they're still a little bit flexible after they've dried. I then take a large ball of the Milla stuff and place that in the front to create the eye. I try not to mess around with this shape too much so that it stays as circular as possible. I then start fleshing out the miniature with more of my Milla stuff, starting around the mouth and filling out the jaws so I can start getting a feel for what the mouth is going to look like. Adding some of the Milla stuff underneath the jaws as well, connecting them to create the lower section of the mouth. Now back to our regularly scheduled camera angles. Once the Milla stuff had set, I add a little bit more to fill out the cracks and corners of the mouth, giving me something to sculpt the details onto. While it's still setting, I add a ring of more material to just create a little bit of like a circular texture that kind of looks like the roof of a mouth, but all over. And then I go in with more of these little tubes of Milla stuff and create the gums. I wanted to have 3 layers of gums, so I add one on the very outside of the jaws, a circle on the inside, and another 3rd layer in between the 2 of these. By adding this little tube of green stuff and then taking one of my round tools to create these indents where I'm going to put the teeth later. I'm pretty sure in another video I swore I would never do teeth like this again, but here I am doing teeth like this again. Once I had repeated the process on the other side, I take some little balls of Milla stuff and stick it onto the end of all of our little tentacles to act as the eyes. So I repeat this process over all of the little tentacles, trying to keep the circular shape as best as I can. The most difficult one to get right was the one shooting flames at the base of the miniature, since I had to wrap it around the armature and then figure out how to keep it a roughly circular shape. Once I had added all of those, I added some more of the Milla stuff around all of these tentacles to fill them out, blending the material at the base of the tentacle to try and create as seamless a transition between the tentacle and the main body of the Beholder. While working on this step of the process, it was very useful to have the wires and the armature be covered in green stuff and not in the Milla stuff, because the Milla stuff doesn't flex, and so having them covered in the green stuff means I can move them around, get them out of the way if I need to while I'm adding the main material for the tentacles. As you can see here, I also added one of the tentacles being kind of like it was recently chopped off in a battle or something like that, which I thought was an interesting kind of fun detail. The next step in the process was to add the teeth. So I roll out a bunch of little triangles, little cones of Milla stuff, and start adding that in using one of my rubber tools and metal tools to press the material into shape and make sure it has a good solid bond to the gums of the mini. Here you can see the finished first layer of teeth. So I then go around and add the other 2 layers. Another way you can do teeth if you want to is by making all the teeth you're going to need beforehand and then letting them set and then gluing them in with super glue. Me personally, I am too lazy to make all the teeth and let them set and then put them in, so I've just decided to do this, partly because it helps me play around with the shape of the teeth and the kind of the curve of the teeth after they're in the mouth, and I can just kind of play around with them and edit them a little bit. After that, I add the first set of eyelids. I wanted this guy to kind of have what would look like the double eyelids that like cats have, as well as having the eye be vertical instead of horizontal. So once I finish those first set of eyelids, I add this large piece of green stuff with a little crook in the very top of it, and I blend that into the rest of the miniature, having it generally follow where the lips are going to be. Which actually, as I was adding all this material, I realized I needed to do something with the lips. So once I had generally figured out the eyelids that I wanted, I take one of my sharp metal tools and I start adding little divots and cracks into the lips around where the teeth are. I was hoping to make this miniature look like it was kind of fleshy, and so having the kind of dried, cracked lips look really worked for what I was trying to go for. I then add a little bit more of the Milla stuff onto the eyelid because it wasn't quite where I wanted it. So I blend that in and add more of the eyelid folds and then repeat the process on the other side. With the eyelids for the main eye finished, it was time to move on to the eyelids of all the other ones. I do this by adding a little circle of green stuff around the eyes and then just blend that in with my fingers primarily. But then I make sure to add little divots to show where the eyes kind of split. The idea is that just like the main one would be vertical, all of these would also be vertical. While doing this, I also am sure to add some more eyelid folds, just like I did for the larger one. And then I repeat this process over the entirety of the miniature. At this point, I decided this miniature needed a base, so I add some super glue onto the ring of wire underneath it, and then just let it set and rest on this base. Once the glue had dried, I come in with a little bit of the Milla stuff just to cover up the wire so that you won't see it later on when we cover this in my basing material. The next step was to smoothen out all of these sculpt lines that were still left over. So I take a large piece of Milla stuff and just start putting it all over the mini and spreading it into all the cracks and crevices and trying to smoothen everything out so that it doesn't look like it was sculpted. I also finish out some details like the lips, which I hadn't gone all the way around with a little crack texture that we had done before. Once I had gone around the entirety of the miniature, I start working on the flames shooting out of the one eye. To be perfectly honest, when I started this, I didn't really know what I was doing. I hadn't done a flame or fire in a very long time. But to make the fire look convincing, I essentially add all of these little points that are curling up from the main body of the flame. But what really helps communicate that this is fire is adding these little swirling patterns and texture throughout the body of the flame. I have those swirl patterns become more and more intense as it gets farther away from the source of the flame. Then, to add some more points of interest throughout the miniature, I add a bunch of these little veins. I had done this in the Displacer Beast video a little while ago, and I thought it was a really cool detail that added a lot of interest to an otherwise bland space on a miniature. So I go around this entire miniature covering him in these little veins, adding small pieces of Milla stuff and blending them into the rest of the miniature with my rubber tools. So I repeat this process several times around the miniature, including adding a couple onto the eye tentacles of the Beholder. With that done, all I needed to do was add a little bit of basing material onto the base, and the sculpt for this miniature is finished. Before we paint this miniature, I have a very exciting announcement. Me and my band Kin are having our very first gig. So for those of you in the Chicagoland area, our gig is going to be at the Montrose Saloon, September 21st at 6 p.m. There's going to be a link in the description to get tickets for it, and we would love to see you there. We're very, very excited about this. This is going to be a 45-minute set, so this is going to be our very first gig we've ever done, our very first proper gig. So we're super excited. We'd love to see you there. Here's what one of our songs sound like.
Friends for years, and if not, it's enough that we both hate it here. So hold on, let's rock it.
So if you like that sound and you live in Chicago, please check us out September 21st, 6 p.m. at the Montrose Saloon. Again, links will be in the description for that. I start by priming the miniature, adding 2 thin coats of an airbrush primer that I just apply with a regular brush. As far as color scheme, I decided I wanted to stick within my comfort zone, and so I base coat this entire miniature with a purple. I don't know what it is, but I am obsessed with purple. I mentioned it in the last video. I don't know why, I just want to paint every single miniature I make a color of some kind and then mix it with purple every single time. I don't know why that is. But either way, the purple I added to this was a little bit too light, so I go in with a slightly darker purple and get all of the shadows. Generally speaking, I would like the first layer I add to be the darkest layer, but I didn't feel like going over the entire miniature again. I then can start working on the highlight, which I worked on for a very, very long time. The highlight color I'm using for this is a light tan or kind of a light yellow color that I'm mixing in with the darkened purple that we add as the first base coat. To blend it out, I'm generally doing a mixture of wet blending and glazing, where you add a very watered down paint, but just with a lot of layers. I generally prefer doing wet blending because I find that it just blends a lot smoother, but this seemed to work, especially for a miniature with a larger surface area. It's hard to do wet blending because all of the paint dries too quickly in one area, then you can't really do a ton of wet blending. Once that's finished though, I start working on the eye. I take the same color I was using before, but add a little bit more white and a little bit more black to it to really desaturate the color and making it a lot lighter. Then, to add a little bit of interest into the eye, I make the same mixture with a little bit less black and add that to the center of the eye, and repeat this process, getting it lighter and lighter and lighter, creating a gradient from the dull gray around the edges of the eye to the slightly brighter yellowish kind of gray towards the middle. As I'm doing this, I also dab this on so that there's a little bit of texture and it's not necessarily a perfect gradient, which really helps this miniature feel natural. I then start working on the other eyes, but for some unknown reason I decided right now would be a good time to add the white for the fire and this eye before I go and repeat the process I had just done over all the eyes before. Sometimes when I'm compiling the videos from like the projects that I've made after the fact, I just sit there wondering, why did I do that in this order? This doesn't make any sense at all. But anyways, I repeat this process around the rest of the eye, keeping it a lot more simple, obviously, and then I can start working on the pupils. I wanted the pupils to be sideways, kind of like they are in goat's eyes. I realized because the eye itself is already sideways, it just kind of looks like a sideways eye, but I still like how it turned out. In order to create the irises, I take a little bit of light blue and add a bunch of tiny little strokes, and then mix in a little bit of a purplish blue to go around those strokes, and I kind of repeat this process over and over and over again until I have the pupil in a space where I like it. In order to do the pupils for the other eyes though, I just add a little bit of the purplish blue because I was not about to do that same process over all of these tiny little eyes and try to make it look right. With that finished, it was time to move on to the mouth. So I add a little bit of red in with the purple texture that I had added before. I also get my hair in the camera, which is why everything's really blurry. But that creates a nice dark magenta-ish color that I add around the entirety of the gums. The biggest issue I find myself having when I'm sculpting these kinds of miniatures, especially ones with lots of teeth, is you can sculpt a miniature that has little spots that you can see, but you cannot paint because there's stuff in the way. And that will always be something to look out for when you're sculpting, is to make sure that you're making a miniature that you can actually paint in its entirety. So there is a little spot of green that I couldn't even get a primer to cover up with. So whenever you're sculpting miniatures like this that have a lot of these sections with lots of detail where stuff is in front of the other, be sure to make sure you can actually paint the entirety of the mini you're making. But once I had gone over the entirety or most of the mouth, as well as the inner eyelids of the main eye, I can start adding paint for the teeth. The color I'm using here is a desaturated yellow ochre, where essentially I just take the light tan yellow ochre color and I add a little bit of black and I add a little bit of white, which is just an easy tip for desaturating colors, because essentially what you're doing is adding gray to whatever color you're painting with. But once I had finished the teeth, I take a watered down purple color and I cover all of the veins in that. It just creates a nice little subtle variation without being too overpowering that implies that there's like some blood inside the veins. After that, I start working on the fire. I decided that I wanted it to be green, so I take a very light green and cover the majority of this white in that. And as I get to the tips of the flames, as it gets farther away from the main body of the flame, I make the color darker and darker. And I do my best this entire time to try to make sure that the very inmost section of the flame and the lowest details are still white. I also make sure that the eye is white and add a little bit of the greens around the edges to make it look like the eye is glowing from within as well. And then I get to do what I think is one of the most satisfying miniature painting things, which is OSL, or object source lighting, where I paint a bunch of green around the rest of the miniature to make it look like it is getting green light shone on it from the fire. In order to make this look convincing, essentially, the closer you are to the flame, the lighter the green color is going to be. I add a bunch over the main eye that is shooting out the flame, as well as making sure to hit a bunch of other areas like the main body of the beholder and especially this section underneath the teeth. This for me personally is always one of the most fun things to paint, because when you get it right, it is so satisfying, and when you can figure out how to make it really look like this creature is being lit up by the flame or whatever light source you have on your miniature, it's just so incredibly satisfying. It also took me a good while. There's a lot of pushing and pulling and just playing with the color until I have it right. Once I had finished with the OSL, I add a gloss varnish onto the eye and the inside of the mouth to make it just look shiny and make it look like it's wet. I also add a little bit of blood effects paint into the severed eye tentacle that we had made earlier. Then to finish out this miniature, I add a little bit of black paint around the base of the mini and add a little bit of a dark wash to finish out the texture onto the basing of the miniature. I'm very happy with this miniature. I think it looks really good. I really think I've definitely come very far as a sculptor compared to the other one. There's a lot of just little details that I was able to do a lot better, especially the smaller eyes. I cut a lot of corners with this old one. You can see I kind of just added the material and sculpted in a loose eye shape. The other thing that I'm noticing is I'm a much better miniature painter than I was. The pupil looks way better than in the first one. There's just this flat color brown for the iris. It's a flat color for the main white of the eye as well in my old one. Yeah, the teeth are a lot better. This is the detailing. I've definitely come a long way in these past 5 years of sculpting miniatures. But it's kind of cool to have this marker of just how far I've come, being able to compare these two miniatures. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, do all the algorithm things. And also don't forget to go check out my Patreon. It's a great way to support the channel for those of you who are interested. But again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.